All right. So the person that saved Jim was Boo Radley. Let's keep reading. We're almost done. Dang. Mr. Arthur Hunter, said Atticus, gently correcting me. Jean Elise, this is Mr. Arthur Radley. I believe he already knows you. If Atticus could blandly introduce me to Boo Radley at a time like this, well, that was Atticus. Boo saw me run instinctively to the bed where Jim was sleeping. For the same shy smile crept across his face. Hot with embarrassment, I tried to cover up by covering Jim up. Don't touch him, said Atticus. Heck Tate sat looking intently at Boo through his horn-rimmed glasses. He was about to speak when Dr. Reynolds came down the hall. Everybody out, he said, as he came in the door. Evening, Arthur. Didn't notice you the first time I was here. Dr. Reynolds' voice was as breezy as his steps, as though he had said it every evening of his life, an announcement that astounded me even more than being in the same room with Boo Radley, of course. Oh, of course, even Boo Radley got sick sometimes, I thought. But on the other hand, I wasn't sure. Dr. Reynolds was carrying a big package wrapped in newspaper. He put it down on Jim's desk and took off his coat. You're quite satisfied he's alive now? Tell you how I knew. When I tried to examine him, he kicked me. He had to put him out good and proper to touch him. So scared, he said to me. Said Atticus, glancing at Boo. Heck, let's go out on the front porch. There's plenty of chairs out there, and it's still warm enough. I wondered why Atticus was inviting us to the front porch instead of the living room, and then I understood. The living room lights were awfully strong. We filed out, first Mr. Tate. Atticus was waiting at the door for him to go ahead of him, and then he changed his mind and followed Mr. Tate. People have the habit of doing everyday things even under the oddest conditions. I was no exception. Come along, Mr. Arthur, I had heard myself saying. You know the house real well. You don't know the house real well. I'll just take you to the porch, sir. He looked down and nodded at me. I led him through the hall and past our living room. Won't you have a seat, Mr. Arthur? This rocking chair is nice and comfortable. My small fantasy about him was alive again. He would be sitting on the porch. Right pretty spell we're having, isn't it, Mr. Arthur? Yes, a right pretty spell. Feeling slightly unreal, I led him to a chair farthest from Atticus and Mr. Tate. It was in a deep shadow. Boo would feel more comfortable in the dark. Atticus was sitting in the swing and Mr. Tate was in the chair next to him. The light from the living room windows were strong on them. I sat beside Boo. Well, heck, Atticus said. Atticus was saying, I guess the thing to do. Good Lord, I'm losing my memory. Atticus pushed up his glasses and pressed his fingers to his eyes. Jim's not quite 13. No, he's already 13. I can't remember. Anyway, it'll come before the county court. What will, Mr. Finch? Mr. Tate uncrossed his legs and leaned forward. Of course, it was clear-cut self-defense, but I'll have to go to the office and hunt up... Mr. Finch, do you think that Jim killed Bob Ewell? Do you think that? You heard what Scout said. There's no doubt about it. She said that Jim got up and yanked him off her. He probably got a hold of Ewell's knife somehow in the dark. We'll find out tomorrow. Mr. Finch, hold on, said Mr. Tate. Jim never stabbed Bob Ewell. Atticus was silent for a moment. He looked at Mr. Tate as if he appreciated what he said, but Atticus shook his head. Heck, it's mighty kind of you, and I know you're doing it from the good of your heart of yours, but don't start anything like that. Mr. Tate got up and went to the edge of the porch. He spat into the shrubbery, and then thrust his hands into his hip pockets and faced Atticus. Like what? He said. I'm sorry if I spoke sharply, Heck, Atticus said simply. But nobody's hushing this up. I don't live like that. I don't live that way. Nobody's going to hush anything up, Mr. Finch. Mr. Tate's voice was quiet, but his boots were planted so solidly on the porch floorboards that it seemed that they grew there. A curious contest, the nature of which eluded me, was developing between my father and the sheriff. It was Atticus's turn to get up and go to the edge of the porch. He said, and spat dryly into the yard. He put his hands in his pockets and faced Mr. Tate. Heck, you haven't said it, but I know what you're thinking. Thank you for it. Jean Louise, he turned to me. You said Jim yanked Mr. Ewell off you. Yes, sir, that's what I thought. See there, Heck? Thank you from the bottom of my heart, but I don't want my boy starting out with something like this over his head. Best way is to clear the air is to have it all out in the open. Let the country come and bring sandwiches. I don't want him growing up with a whisper about him. I don't want anybody saying Jim Finch, his daddy paid him in to get him out of that. Sooner we get this over with, the better. Mr. Finch, Mr. Tate said stolidly. Bob Buell fell on his knife. He killed himself. Atticus walked to the corner of the porch. He looked at the wisteria vine. In his own way, I thought, each was as stubborn as the other, and I wondered who would give in first. Atticus' stubbornness was quiet and rarely evident, but in some ways he was as set as the Cunninghams. Mr. Tate was unschooled and blunt, but he was equal to my father's. Heck, Atticus' back was turned. If this thing's hushed up, it'll be a simple denial to Jim of the way I've tried to raise him. Sometimes I think I'm a total failure as a parent, but I'm all they've got. Before Jim looks at anyone else, he looks at me, and I've tried to live so I can look squarely back at him. If I connived at something like this, frankly, I couldn't meet his eye. And the day I can't do that, I'll know I've lost him. I don't want to lose him and Scout, because they're all I've got. Mr. Finch. Mr. Tate was still planted on the floorboards. Bob Buell fell on his knife. I could prove it. Atticus wheeled around, his hands dug into his pocket. Heck, can't you even try to see it my way? You've got children of your own, but I'm older than you. When mine are grown, I'll be an old man. If I'm still around. But right now, if they don't trust me, they won't trust anybody. Jim and Scout know what happened. If they hear of me saying downtown something different happened, heck, I won't have them anymore. I can't live one way in town and another in my home. Mr. Tate rocked on his heels and said patiently. He'd flung Jim down. He stumbled over a root under that tree, and look, here I can show you. Mr. Tate reached in his side pocket and withdrew a long switchblade knife. As he did so, Dr. Reynolds came to the door. The son, deceased under that tree, Doctor, just inside the schoolyard. Got a flashlight? Better have this one. I can ease around and turn my car lights on, said Dr. Reynolds, but he took Mr. Tate's flashlight. Jim's all right. He won't wake up tonight. I hope so. Or he won't wake up tonight, I hope, so don't worry. That the knife that killed him, Heck? No, sir, still in him. Looked like a kitchen knife from the handle. Ken ought to be there with the hearse by now, Doctor. Night. Mr. Tate flicked open the knife. It was like this, he said. He held the knife and pretended to stumble. Sorry, guys, I got something on my throat. As he leaned forward, his left arm went down in front of him. See there? Stabbed himself through the soft stuff between those ribs. His whole weight drove it in. Mr. Tate closed the knife and jammed it back in his pocket. Scout is 8 years old, he said. She was too scared to know exactly what went on. You'd be surprised, Atticus said grimly. I'm not saying she made it up. I'm saying she was too scared to know exactly what happened. It was mighty dark out there, black as ink. It'd take somebody mighty used to the dark to make a competent witness. I won't have it, Atticus said softly. God damn it, I'm not thinking of Jim. Mr. Tate's boot hit the floorboards so hard that the light in Mrs. Maudie's bedroom went on. Miss Stephanie Crawford's lights went on. And Atticus and Mr. Tate looked across the street, then at each other, and they waited. When Mr. Tate spoke again, his voice was barely audible. Mr. Finch, I hate to fight you when you're like this. You've been under a strain tonight no man should ever have to go through. Why you ain't in bed from it, I don't know. But I do know, for once, that you haven't been able to put two and two together. And we've got to get this settled tonight, because tomorrow will be too late. Bob Buell's got a kitchen knife in his craw. Mr. Tate added that Atticus wasn't going to stand there and maintain that any boy Jim's size with a busted arm had fight in him enough, or had enough fight left in him to tackle and kill a grown man in the pitch dark. Heck, said Atticus abruptly. That was a switchblade you were waving. Where'd you get it? Took it off a drunk man, Mr. Tate answered coolly. I was trying to remember. Mr. Ewell was on me, and then he went down. Jim must have gotten up, at least, I thought. Heck. I said I took it off a drunk man downtown tonight. You'll probably found that kitchen knife in the dump somewhere, honed it down, and bided his time. Just bided his time. Atticus made his way to the swing and sat down, his hands dangling limply between his knees. He was looking at the floor. He had moved with the same slowness that night in front of the jail when I thought it took him forever to fold his newspaper and toss it in his chair. Excuse me. Mr. Tate clumped softly around the porch. It ain't your decision, Mr. Finch. It's all mine. It's my decision and my responsibility. For once, if you don't see it my way, there's not much you can do about it. If you want to try, I'll call you a liar to your face. Your boy never stabbed Bob Ewell, he said slowly. Didn't come near a mile of it. And you know it. All he wanted to do was get him and his sister safely home. Mr. Tate stopped pacing. He stopped in front of Atticus, and his back was to us. I'm not a very good man, sir, but I am the sheriff of Macon County. Lived in this town all my life, and I'm going on 43 years old. Know everything that's happened here since before I was born. There's a black boy dead for no reason, and this man's responsible for its dead. Let the dead bury the dead this time, Mr. Finch. Let the dead bury the dead. Mr. Tate went to the swing and picked up his hat. It was lying beside Atticus. Mr. Tate pushed his hair back and put his hat on. I never heard tell that it's against the law for a citizen to do his utmost to prevent a crime from being committed, which is exactly what he did. But maybe you'll say it's my duty to tell the town all about it and not hush it up. Know what would happen? All the ladies in Macomb County, including my wife, would be knocking on his door bringing angel food cakes. To my way of thinking, Mr. Finch, taking the one man who's done you in this town a great service and dragging him with his shy ways into the limelight, to me that's a sin. It's a sin, and I'm not about to have it on my head. If it was any other man, it'd be different, but not this man, Mr. Finch. Mr. Tate was trying to dig a hole in the floor with the toe of his boot. He pulled his nose and then massaged his left arm. I may not be much, Mr. Finch, but I'm still sheriff of Macomb County, and Bob Ewell fell on his knife. Good night, sir. Mr. Tate stamped off the porch and strode across the front yard. His car door slammed, and he drove away. Atticus sat looking at the floor for a long time. Finally, he raised his head. Scout, he said, Mr. Ewell fell on his knife. Can you possibly understand? Atticus looked like he needed cheering up, and I ran to him and hugged and kissed him with all my might. Yes, sir, I understand, I reassured him. Mr. Tate was right. Atticus disengaged and then looked at me. What do you mean? Well, it'd be sort of like shooting a mockingbird, wouldn't it? Atticus put his face in my hair and rubbed it. When he got up and walked across the porch into the shadows, his youthful step had returned. Before he went inside the house, he stopped in the front of Boo Radley and said, Thank you for my children, Arthur.